Most world-building advice talks about imagination. More lore, bigger maps, deeper backstories, but that's not what makes a world believable. A world feels real when it doesn't bend for the story, when things exist before they happen, when actions follow rules instead of narrative convenience, when consequences don't just reset. And this is not about symbolism or interpretation, it's about structure, which is exactly the problem semantics is built to solve. Semantics is the study of meaning, and at its core it asks, given a world, which statements in it are true? Before you can say Bob likes Sally, Bob must exist, Sally must exist, liking must be possible as a relation, and the world must specify when these relations hold. That's already a constructed world. And Tolkien, the great world builder, mentions this kind of structure. A world is not just a backdrop for events, but a system that exists independently of any one story. That's why he cared so much about internal consistency, narrators, and competing myths, to make the world feel ontologically real. And once you start seeing world building in this way, a lot of great fiction suddenly makes sense. And I wanted to show you how this works using some of my favorite animated worlds. I'm gonna focus on ones that most people haven't heard of, because of course Avatar The Last Airbender is phenomenal in terms of world building, but I wanted to focus on Russian and Soviet animations that most probably have never heard of or seen. So rule number 1, a world must define what exists. What does this world actually contain? Before anything can happen in a story, the world itself has to exist. Not just a vague sense, but very concretely. What things are in it, what places exist there, what objects are available to the characters. If the story doesn't answer these questions, even implicitly, the world feels unstable. Things appear when convenient, disappear when they're not, and the audience can feel that something is off, even if they can't say why. This is the first rule of meaning, not just storytelling. You can't talk about something unless it already exists. And when people talk about world-building elements, they're usually pointing to different parts of the same question. What is included into that world? This includes practical elements or characters like food, tools, clothing, transportation, shelter. How do characters eat, travel, build, fix things, like the items? Geography or maps, where anything is located, how far apart these places are, what paths exist there, rivers, mountains, anything spatially important. Additionally, some even also add cosmology, like what kind of universe this is, a planet, a solar system, multiple planes, something stranger. What is the bigger extension of space? These things aren't just decorations, they're constraints. They define what kind of actions are even possible. Again, going back to Tolkien, the world has to make sense on its own terms, even when the story steps away from it. It has to feel like it continues to exist independently of any particular event. And semantics formalizes this because it's extremely important for that field. So I'm going to briefly explain how semantics does it, so you have a clear way to think about world building. At the most basic level, a world can be thought of as a set, a list of everything that exists in it. As a mini example, we might define a tiny fantasy world like this. So you have the set of the Little Prince, the Rose, B612, and the Sun. Those are supposedly the only items in our tiny fantasy world. That is it. And of course, it's not a perfect semantic novel if you are a semanticist, but for now, I'm just gonna stick to this. What matters is the idea. Nothing exists unless it's in this list, and everything on the list exists whether or not anything is currently happening. World building has to do the same thing. And this idea may feel a bit abstract, but I'll give an example of one of my favorite animations to make this a bit clearer. So, Smешарики, or Kikoriki in the English version, is a long-running Russian animated series set in a deliberately small, closed world. It follows a fixed group of animal characters living in a single shared environment, and each episode tells a short, very short, they're like 5 minutes, absurd story. But the storytelling is unusually rich and full of references to philosophy, science, and cinema and other works of animation. But what makes this series special is how seriously it treats the existence of this world. You have a map showing everybody's location, so you always know who lives where they live, what kind of things exist around them. Nothing appears out of nowhere. Distances are consistent, and objects don't show up once and then vanish forever. They usually reoccur. They break, they get reused, and since this is such a long series and not everyone has seen all of the episodes, the characters don't necessarily remember them, but the same items appear every once in a while. The characters themselves are just as stable. Each one has a very clear role, temperament, a way of thinking. If that were to change arbitrarily, the episodes wouldn't just feel out of character, it would collapse because things that were previously true about the world would suddenly stop being true. This is where the semantic idea becomes visible without being necessarily named. The inventory of the world is fixed. Because of that, meaning doesn't reset every episode. What's remarkable is how much the show manages to do within those limits. The best episodes don't rely on adding new mechanics or expanding the setting dramatically. They recycle the same material as an experiment inside the already defined bounds. The world can and does expand, but it does it gradually. We are not constantly shaken back and forth between different realities. And as a result, when something goes wrong or something is different, it feels like a real problem inside of a real system and not just a plot trick. This is also why the series can support such a wide range of different versions, I guess I would say. They have many different alternatives, like a 3D version that teaches you science, a very 2D version that teaches you about traffic safety, I believe. There is the ongoing 2D version, which was the original. There are just multiple different versions, and they all coexist together. And also, additionally, it's just a very good animation. So though the inventory is limited, the emotional and conceptual space it covers is enormous. The show talks openly about loneliness, creativity, imitation, care, and responsibility, and the purpose of existence. All things very important to people and all things rarely covered in most children's cartoons. Characters are allowed long monologues, episodes are often unresolved, and meanings are not forced, they're often left for the audience to sit with. I really respect the creators for treating the kids watching it seriously, because they're not as clueless as you might think, and I really respect that. I even have an entire video praising children for their language learning abilities, which I'll put right here if you're interested. They're also, as I mentioned before, extremely sharp about references, so the series is deeply aware of animation history and not only film history too. There's an episode explicitly referencing Ёжик в тумане, or they called it Ёжик в туманности, referencing the world-renowned Soviet animated film by Yuri Narstein, The Hedgehog in the Fog, which is also part of why I named this channel Cartoons in the Fog, because Hedgehog in the Fog, Cartoons in the Fog. I thought it was kind of cool. So yeah, great series. The series lasts not despite its limits, but because of them, because it created this world. From a semantic point of view, this is exactly what you want. If something isn't part of the world, you can't meaningfully talk with it. If the inventory keeps changing, meaning collapses. But if the world is stable, meaning accumulates. And Smешарики is quite small. There's very limited characters, objects, but that's exactly what holds it together and why it's one of the greatest ongoing animated series, I would say. On to rule number 2. A world must define its rules. So how do things relate to each other and what usually follows? When something happens in a good fictional world, the audience feels, yes, given this world, that would make sense. And that feeling doesn't come from realism, it comes from rules. You don't need to spell these rules out formally. The audience just needs to be able to learn them and rely on them. But I will explain them formally just using our previous example with the Little Prince. From before, we have our Little Prince, our Rose, our planet, and our sun. The list tells us what exists, but it doesn't yet tell us how these things are allowed to interact with each other. So to do that, we need rules about relations. For example, we could add to this world statements such as this. The Little Prince likes Rose, the Rose likes the Little Prince lives on this planet, and the Rose lives on this planet, and also the Little Prince watches the sun because he likes to watch sunsets. Then you have, in our massive list of everything that follows for this model, we have our list of entities and we have our list of rules, so to speak. So now, using this kind of similar concept, we can apply it to our world building. They limit what can happen and what can't. So those would be physical rules. Can characters fly? Does time move normally? Does magic behave predictably? Those kinds of rules. And also cultural and social rules. How meaning works between individual characters, for example. Who has the power? What counts as respect or insult? What actions triggers punishment or obligation? Who likes who does what? Just any connection one character or thing can have with another. And this matters because when these rules are clear, stories don't need constant justification. The audience can predict outcomes and be surprised only when something truly new happens. A rule that they didn't think about, maybe. When rules are vague or constantly rewritten, nothing sticks. Events feel weightless and consequences don't accumulate. It doesn't seem realistic in the sense that everything just feels kind of pointless and unnecessary. Good world building doesn't add more rules, it commits to the ones it already has. And so again, for a more concrete example, I wanted to share an animation called Kin-dza-dza. Kin-dza-dza was originally a Soviet film, but then they made an animation, and this animation specifically, as well as the original film, builds an entire world out of a small set of brutally enforced rules and then demonstrates them over and over and over in very concrete ways. So Just a little bit about the animation. It's about two ordinary Soviet men who accidentally end up stranded on a distant desert planet. Society runs on very strange rules, which I'll talk about. Their goal is to try to get home. So early on, the film makes the following rules unmistakable. Rule number 1, everyone is classified into either Chetlanian or Patsak. Those are the two races, I guess you could say, and they are determined by this device called a vizator. If you point the vizator and you see an orange light, that means that a person is a Chetlanian, and if it's green, then he's a Patsak. And how the device works, we don't know, we don't care, that's not important to the story. Just perfect, you don't need too much detail. All you know that this device determines Patsak or Chetlanian. Next rule, Patsaks have mandatory restrictions. So if you're a Patsak, you must wear a tsak, which is like a bell on your nose, and you must squat and say ku when meeting a Chetlanian. Ku. You may also perform. They have various strange performances, and if you're a Patsak, you need to perform in a cage. Otherwise, that's a violation of the rule, and you will be punished. So, rule number 3. Even the Chetlanian hierarchy is also encoded. If you're a low-ranking Chetlanian, you have to say ku 2 times to a yellow trouser-wearing Chetlanian. If it's a maroon trouser-wearing Chetlanian, you have to say ku 3 times. If it's a page, I think then it's 4 times. So there is like a hierarchical structure to this greeting and ku saying, and getting the number of ku wrong is a violation of the rules. Another thing I wanted to mention was the fact that both the film and the cartoon have like a vocabulary for this planet. You can see ku, you can see kutse, you can... Another side note on ku, it's not a greeting per se, it's required as an act of submission to a certain extent. So the reason I'm mentioning all these rules is because the two main characters learn all of these rules gradually, and when they break the rules, they are brutally punished because both of them happen to be Patsak, meaning that they get harsh punishments. Breaking the rules results in an intervention by a Tsolop, who is like a police officer, an authority. And so the reason why this works so nicely for this particular story is because the characters don't know these rules and they have to learn them. So they have to adjust to the setting of the rules of Pluk by colliding with all of them throughout the story. At the beginning, they are ignored, and the moment they take out kutse or matches, which is the currency, everyone starts bargaining and immediately exploiting them for this currency. And not knowing how valuable kutse really is, they hand it over to smugglers for inspection, quote unquote, and are instantly abandoned. They learn how most tend to selfishly take what they need to survive under these very strict rules. And so the two characters kind of figure out how to navigate that kind of system. So rules are great, but there is one last step to world building, and that is history. A world only becomes real once it has a past, when things start to persist and accumulate. So a world must have a past. How did this world come to be the place it is at this moment in the story? So something was true, then something happened, and then something else is true. In semantics, statements are not just true or false. An event happens, it leaves traces, and later statements are evaluated based on those traces. You don't reset the model after each sentence, you update it. In semantics, some rules describe states, they hold over a certain period of time, and others describe events, and they happen at a certain moment. As an example for our tiny model, we have our little prince that lives on B612 is a state, and Little Prince Watches the Sun is an event. It's not consistent. He isn't constantly watching the sun. And so the key rule is that he watches the sun only when he is on B612 is true. And so formally it would look like this. I will put it on the screen. You don't necessarily have to understand all of it. And so for this point, I wanted to add maybe my favorite Soviet animation. It's called Tайна, третьей планеты, or Mystery of the Third Planet. It's a story that follows a simple expedition, a professor, his daughter Alisa, and a spaceship captain. And they travel this galaxy collecting rare animals for a zoo on Earth. The plot never treats space as empty. Every place they visit was already shaped by earlier events. Species have gone extinct, explorers have disappeared, machines are broken, because someone sabotaged them long ago. And so records exist, but they're incomplete and misleading or deliberately hidden. And so this mystery itself only works because the world has memory. A talking bird repeats words spoken from years earlier, flowers replay events that happened already, revealing crimes after the fact. So the villains are dangerous to the viewer, not because they're powerful, because we don't know them, we don't know their power, but because of what they already did and covered up. Nothing appears just in time for the plot. Information is recovered and not invented. Once a fact is learned, it stays learned. Once a mistake is uncovered, it permanently changes what the characters can do next. The heroes don't reshape the universe, they navigate consequences left behind by others. That's why the setting feels like its own entity. It pushes back, it remembers, it shapes characters the way real places shape real people. As a side note, Тайна третьей планеты has a slightly bigger universe too. It has Гости из будущего, or the guest from the future, which also has Алиса Селезнёва, the girl who is also in Тайна третьей планеты. She has her own story there, and so it expands into this like multiverse, sort of like the Harry Potter series, or Star Wars maybe is another good example, where it expands into multiple different stories and the setting lives away from the characters. So great world building isn't necessarily about imagination, it's about restraint. You define what exists, you commit to how it works, and you let consequences accumulate. Do that and the story doesn't need to be forced, it emerges. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're interested in this kind of content about animation, cartoons, linguistics, language learning, please subscribe, it helps me a lot. And do let me know in the comments what kind of videos you'd like me to make, because this idea was actually recommended by one of the comments. If you're interested about good world building, I would highly recommend you watch these French animations. I think they have very, very good world building. Yeah, I would highly recommend them. As I mentioned before, I have a video on how children learn languages and how to learn through curiosity and through enjoyment and entertainment. Yeah, so thank you, and I'll see you soon.